I think the big takeaway locally is that the Republican Party in Rhode Island needs to figure out how they're going to actually be viable. There was a very competitive race in the 2nd District, but statewide Republicans did very poorly, and it seems as if they have no plan for a sustainable future. And if that doesn't change, then they're going to be in trouble for at least a generation. I think on the national level, we saw basically what we would expect, a very divided country that tends to activate people. We had high turnout for an off-year election, a congressional election year. And we have a country where on the coast and in selective parts of the Midwest, it's a fairly comfortable Democratic majority, and the rest of the country is solidly Republican in an even more certain direction. So we're seeing increasing polarization in our country. And that means nobody wins. It means it's stalemate. I think the results of the House race are significant for Rhode Island in the sense that it will lose the leadership that David Cicilline had in the 1st District as being sort of one of the leaders of the majority party. The Republicans haven't officially taken over control, but they will. And I think that, so the profile of David Cicilline will remain high, but the importance of that role, because he's now in the minority, will be diminished. I also think, though, that Seth Magaziner being elected as one of several, but not a large number of Democrats getting elected for the first time, might actually have a high profile, and his experience as treasurer could get him on a very important committee that affects Rhode Island. So it might actually turn out better because we now have someone who's a finance expert who gets a committee assignment. I think the biggest surprise in Rhode Island was that Ashley Kalus was on the ballot, that Ashley Kalus, who was really not a Rhode Islander, didn't live in Rhode Island until she decided she wanted to run for governor, had lived here in the past, got the nomination from the Republican Party and ended up on the ballot. That's probably the biggest surprise. I think the other big surprise was the extent to which marijuana sales were approved at the local level in all but 8 towns in the state. And I was a little surprised that there was such widespread support for that. I think, the 2nd Congressional District, when you look at fundamentals that explain outcomes of elections, they all pointed in the direction of the Democrats. It's a less strong Democratic seat than the 1st Congressional District. Rhode Island is a Democratic state, and to send a Republican to the House of Representatives is a big deal, particularly in the era of nationalization of elections. And Alan Fung had to run as a Republican just the same way a Republican in Texas had to run, and that was a much harder thing for him to do. Polling is extremely difficult, and because the sample sizes of all the polls were very small, the margin of error led me to suspect that those polls were not reflecting what was happening. I think the biggest surprise nationally of the night was how deeply red Florida went. Florida is now a very comfortable Republican state for national elections, and I found that very surprising. Marco Rubio was expected to have a difficult race, and he won by 14 points, and so I think that is probably the biggest national surprise. The other big national surprise clearly was the models that political scientists use predicted about 30 seats being transferred from the Democrats to the Republican in the House, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It's going to be more like 15 to 20. And so, it looks as if Democrats did better than expected. Turnout in Rhode Island is like the tale of 2 districts. If you look at the 1st District, where David Cicilline did not have a serious challenge, turnout was okay, but lower than 2018. If you look at the 2nd District, where there was a competitive race and 2 very good candidates, Fung and Magaziner, Magaziner ended up with 52% of the vote, getting more votes overall than David Cicilline, even though he had almost 70% of the vote in his district. And so I think you saw turnout because of a competitive election that was very, very high in the second district, but not in the first district, where it was a little lower than we would have expected. Midterm elections are almost never good predictors for the upcoming presidential election. And the reason is there's a cycle known as surge and decline, where when a president runs, they bring in with them, when they win, a number of members of their own party. But then 2 years later, there's a decline in those people because they don't have the president running, and they end up losing more often. And so what we see this year doesn't really do much at all to tell us what's going to happen in 2024, other than possibly the role of former President Trump. Former President Trump is being looked at, and it's possible that he's responsible for the Republicans not winning as many seats as they thought they would win, because he helped recruit some very, very poor candidates when you look at the things that make a candidate an attractive candidate who has a chance of winning. So for example, in Georgia, even in Pennsylvania with Dr. Oz, but a number of races where Trump pushed a candidate who got the nomination ended up being very bad candidates in the general election, and they would not have gotten the nomination without Trump. So I think the negative Trump effect, I think, might be the only significant thing for 2024, and it will lessen his chances of being the nominee for the Republicans. I think this election, just like the last 2 or 3 elections, are kind of interesting from the political science angle to watch, because we're in a transition period where the old party alignments are changing, but they haven't fully matured yet, and so we don't know where they're going. So some Democrats have moved to Republicans, some Republicans have moved to Democrat, but it's not done yet. It's not a permanent coalition yet. And in about 20, 30 years, we might be able to identify this year or 2024 as the year things got solidified. And so I think it's a really interesting time to pay attention to what's going on, and the American public gets that, and that's why turnout has been going up over the past 3 or 4 elections. And so in some ways, even though it's very controversial and very polarized, it's very good for democracy, because more people are taking an interest, more people are voting, and a democracy, even a representative democracy and a constitutional democracy like ours, depends on citizen activism. And so it's a good thing to see more people being active.